All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we are going deep
Mm.
into the world of Milan Kundera,
Kundera.
The Unbearable Lightness of Being.
It's a big one.
This is a book I know you love.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of those books I think that really just stays with you. It's such a powerful exploration of so many different facets of what it means to be human.
And it's interesting because when I think about this book, it's one of those that, like, there are certain images, certain scenes that really do stick with you and just kind of stay in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what makes Kundera such a powerful writer, is he has this ability to just create these very, very vivid images.
Yeah, and of course, this came from a listener suggestion, and I was so excited to get into this one.
Me too. Yeah, I was really looking forward to it.
We're going to be exploring some really big ideas here. This tension between lightness and weight, the significance of these fleeting moments that we have in life, the kind of messy reality of love and commitment. And of course, this is all happening against a backdrop of some really significant historical events and political upheaval.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that makes Kundera's work so compelling is that he's not afraid to tackle these really big, weighty topics.
He really isn't. And he does it in a way that just kind of sneaks up on you, I think.
Hmm.
All right, so to get us started, let's really unpack this central idea of lightness and weight, because this seems to be like the foundational kind of paradox that runs through the whole novel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good place to start is with Kundera's use of Nietzsche's concept of eternal return.
Oh, yeah.
So, Nietzsche's idea is essentially a thought experiment,
Yeah.
right? It's this idea that if everything that has happened will happen again and again and again infinitely.
And again and again and again.
So, imagine that for a moment, every choice, every little action repeating endlessly.
Mm.
That would imbue even the smallest things with this almost unbearable weight of consequence.
Yeah, it's almost paralyzing, isn't it, to think about like reliving every awkward conversation, every mistake.
It's heavy, right? Every bad haircut? Yeah, every bad haircut.
For eternity. It's a lot.
That's a lot to carry.
But Kundera, he kind of inverts this a little bit, right? He suggests that because our lives only happen once, there's that great line, einmal ist keinmal, that Tomas says, once is never, which means that in a strange way, life can actually feel incredibly light.
Exactly.
Huh.
And because there's no chance to revise, there's no possibility of a do-over, everything feels almost like a first draft.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's light.
Like we're all just kind of winging it.
Yeah, we're all just kind of sketching it out as we go.
Yeah, and so we see this play out in Tomas's experience, right? At first, after he leaves Tereza, he feels this sweet lightness of being.
Right.
This like sense of freedom, unburdened by obligation, but then something shifts.
Yeah, and it's that weight of compassion that really pulls him back to her.
It does, and it makes you kind of wonder, is that lightness truly sustainable or even really desirable in the long run? You know?
I think that's a great question.
If we were all just floating around,
Floating around.
would it even really mean anything?
I think it speaks to a deeper human need for connection. And I think that's what Kundera is getting at with this idea of compassion. He even gives us this really striking definition of it.
He does.
He calls it the maximal capacity of affective imagination, the art of emotional telepathy.
Wow.
Right, so it's not just this superficial feeling of pity or sympathy.
Yeah.
It's the ability to truly step into someone else's shoes, to feel what they're feeling, their joy, their fear, their pain.
Yeah.
And as Kundera points out, this deep empathy, this compassion, can actually feel like a much heavier burden than our own suffering.
It's so true. And it really makes you think about how deeply we allow ourselves to connect with the emotions of other people.
Yeah. Do we let ourselves be weighed down by the suffering of others, or do we try to maintain that lightness by keeping a certain distance?
Right, right. And it's not to say that one is necessarily better than the other, but it's that tension that I think Kundera is really interested in exploring.
Yeah.
So if we connect this idea of einmal ist keinmal, once is never, back to our own lives and our own decision-making, it raises a really interesting question. How do we really know if we've made the right choice when we only get one shot at life, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question we all grapple with to some extent, right?
All time, I think.
And, Kundera highlights this ephemeral nature of our existence. He says, we live everything as it comes without warning, like an actor going on cold.
I love that image of the actor just stepping onto the stage with no rehearsal.
No net.
Yeah, no net, no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
And because of this, he argues There is no means of testing which decision is better because there is no basis for comparison.
Right.
So think about Tomas when he's agonizing over whether or not to call Tereza back to Prague.
Right.
He can't run a simulation
Right.
in some alternate reality to see what would happen if he didn't make that call.
He's making this huge decision in the dark.
Totally in the dark. And I think we can all relate to that feeling of having to make these big choices without knowing what the outcome is going to be.
Absolutely.
And this really reinforces that other metaphor that he uses, the sketch metaphor for life.
Yeah.
It's not even a preliminary drawing for some future masterpiece. It's a sketch for nothing, an outline that will never be filled in again.
And that really emphasizes the unique and unrepeatable nature of each of our lives.
It does. And it makes you think about the weight that we put on these individual decisions when ultimately they're just part of this one-time sketch.
Mm.
So then Kundera introduces us to Tereza, and he frames her arrival in Tomas's life as something that reveals this irreconcilable duality of body and soul. And this seems to be like another one of these recurring tensions throughout the novel.
Yeah, the sense of our inner selves versus our physical beings.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to consider this idea in a historical context. You know, for centuries, there's been this philosophical divide with the body often seen as separate, even inferior to the soul.
Yeah, like the soul is the true self, the seat of thought and feeling, and the body is just this vessel.
It's exactly this kind of earthly cage.
Right. And we see this play out in Tereza's anxieties, right? Especially around her physical appearance.
Right.
She's self-conscious about her small breasts, the prominent areolae.
Yeah. And these physical concerns really stand in stark contrast to her rich inner life, her deep emotional world.
They do. And she also has these recurring dreams of death,
Mm.
which further kind of complicate this relationship between her physical self and her inner self.
Yeah, it's like she's almost yearning for a release from the confines of her body.
Yeah.
And this split is also evident in her daily life.
Mm.
You know, her waking hours and her dream world almost feel like competing realities for her.
Yeah. And when you compare her very profound emotional investment in her relationship with Tomas to his more detached approach to physical intimacy,
Right.
it really highlights just how differently we can experience and prioritize those different aspects of a relationship.
Yeah, and how those differences can create tension and misunderstanding.
Yeah, for sure. So this leads us into this whole other really complex dynamic that Kundera explores. Love, jealousy, and dependence.
Hmm.
And there's this really pivotal scene where Tomas feels this pang of jealousy watching Tereza dance with another man.
Right.
And it's not just that she's dancing with someone else. It's the realization that her desire to please her devotion might not be exclusively directed towards him.
Yeah, and it forces him to confront the idea that her physical presence is in a way interchangeable,
Yeah.
that it could be perfectly thinkable coupled with any male body.
Wow. That's a really kind of clinical way to put it.
It is, and it's interesting because even though he can intellectualize it that way, he still feels deeply wounded.
Yeah.
He still experiences jealousy.
Yeah.
It reveals the often irrational nature of our emotions.
Absolutely. And then we have this whole other layer of complexity with Tereza's dream about the needles under her fingernails.
Oh, yeah, that's a disturbing image.
It is a very visceral, very disturbing image. And as Kundera points out, it's like this unconscious manifestation of all this inner turmoil that she's carrying around. All these anxieties and fears that she might not even be fully aware of herself.
Yeah, her subconscious is speaking.
It really is. And then there's this other really interesting concept that he introduces this vertigo, this insuperable longing to fall.
Right.
And it manifests physically in her clumsiness, but it's also this really potent metaphor for her desire to escape her circumstances, her reliance on Tomas, and maybe even the weight of her own existence.
Yeah, and he even links this feeling of vertigo to the intoxication of the weak, suggesting it's a surrender to powerlessness rather than an active confrontation of it.
Right, so it's easier to just kind of give in to that feeling of falling than to try to resist it.
Exactly.
But despite this underlying urge to fall to escape, she remains so deeply connected to Tomas. Even when she leaves for a period, he ultimately returns to her, driven by that powerful force of compassion that he feels his own internal esmosen.
Right, it must be.
It must be.
And it really underscores the complexity of their bond, that even in a desire for freedom, there's this inescapable pull of connection.
Yeah, they can't seem to escape each other even when they try.
Right.
So then Kundera introduces us to Sabina and Franz,
Right.
And through them, we get this whole other layer of complexity in terms of misunderstandings, particularly how the same words can hold completely different meanings for different people.
Mm,
So, for example, Sabina has this very unconventional view of fidelity, right,
right.
compared to Franz.
Right.
She's charmed more by betrayal than by fidelity, and this isn't just a casual preference.
It's deeply rooted in her past.
It is.
It's a rejection of her father's strict puritanical upbringing.
Yeah, for her, that word fidelity itself carries these negative connotations,
Right.
represents the very constraints that she's trying to break free from.
Exactly.
Whereas Franz, even though he himself is unfaithful,
Right.
he seems to cling to this more traditional, almost romanticized ideal of fidelity.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this really stark contrast
You do.
that highlights how much our individual histories shape our understanding of even these seemingly simple concepts.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about all the assumptions we make when we use words,
It does.
right? Unaware of the different meanings they might hold for other people.
Yeah, we think we're speaking the same language, but often we're not.
Exactly.
And then we see another really great example of this with Sabina's aversion to parades.
Right.
It's not just that she dislikes them, she has this visceral, almost physical reaction to them.
Yeah, it stems from her experience as a child being forced to participate in these May Day parades.
Yeah.
So for her, they represent this kind of forced conformity and this loss of individuality.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because that's completely at odds with how Franz sees parades.
Right.
For him, they're the grand march of European history, this
Yeah.
symbol of progress and collective identity.
Yeah, he sees them as something grand and meaningful,
Yeah.
and she sees them as oppressive and meaningless.
Yeah.
And what's so ironic is that Franz considers his own life, his intellectual academic existence as unreal,
Yeah.
and the parades as real,
Right.
when Kundera seems to be suggesting that the opposite might be true.
Yeah. That his inner world is actually the more authentic reality.
Exactly.
And the parades are just this kind of superficial spectacle.
Yeah, it makes you question what we consider real in our own lives.
It does.
Right, what truly matters.
And this brings us to Kundera's idea of the short dictionary of misunderstood words.
Right.
So he uses these terms like woman, compassion, lightness, weight,
Right.
to illustrate how much meaning can get lost in translation.
Hmm.
How one word can evoke such different emotional responses based on our individual experiences.
And it's such a powerful reminder of the limitations of language and the potential for miscommunication in all of our relationships.
Yeah. And if we think about how these misunderstandings play out in the characters' relationships, they often lie at the heart of their conflicts and their inability to truly connect.
Yeah, even when they have deep feelings for each other,
Right.
they're speaking different languages.
So it's impossible to talk about this novel without acknowledging the political context of the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia and its profound impact on the lives of these characters.
Right. It's not just a backdrop. It's a force that shapes their decisions and their worldviews.
Yeah, we see this drunken carnival of hate erupt.
Yeah.
The fear, the uncertainty, and then, of course, the devastating impact of that forced compromise agreement in Moscow.
Yeah, particularly on figures like Dubček. You know, his speech afterwards is just heartbreaking.
It really is filled with all these hesitations and long silences.
Yeah, reflecting the trauma of that moment.
And for Tomas, this oppressive political climate directly leads to his resignation from the clinic.
Right.
After his article is twisted and misrepresented,
Yeah.
he sees this as a form of retreat, a way to protect his integrity and avoid being further manipulated by a system that's become inherently dishonest.
Right.
And it's a really stark reminder of how political forces can infiltrate even the most personal aspects of our lives. So shifting to the more intimate aspects of the novel, Kundera really delves into the nature of love and sex, particularly through Tomas's perspective.
Right.
And he famously draws this distinction between love and lovemaking, which Tereza really struggles to understand.
Yeah.
For Tomas, sex seems to be driven by this almost scientific curiosity.
Right.
This need to uncover the 1 millionth part that makes each woman unique.
He's searching for that elusive essence.
Yeah, he's like a detective of the soul almost.
Right.
And he approaches these encounters with other women with this very detached, almost analytical lens.
Yeah,
But his connection with Tereza is different, isn't it?
it is.
Kundera emphasizes that he loved her before he even began to analyze her,
Right.
before he could even reach for that imaginary scalpel.
So their bond transcends that purely analytical approach.
Yeah, and it suggests that maybe some connections defy rational explanation.
Yeah, they just are.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole other element that he brings in this idea of the theological problem of shit.
Yeah, this is where things get really
A
interesting.
little unexpected, right?
It is. What do you think he's trying to get at with this kind of earthy contemplation?
Well, I think he's using the very existence of excrement to explore the nature of human existence
Okay.
and our complicated relationship with our physicality.
Yeah.
If we were created in God's image and divinity is supposed to be perfect, how do we reconcile that with the inherent messiness of our bodies?
Yeah.
Right.
It's a good question.
And he even delves into these historical and theological perspectives, referencing different thinkers who've grappled with this question.
Right.
The idea seems to be that our sense of disgust and perhaps even the intensity of sexual excitement
Hmm.
are somehow tied to our fall from grace.
Yeah, like in paradise, there might have been pleasure, but maybe not this kind of raw, visceral excitement that we experience now.
Exactly.
So it's almost like shit represents this unavoidable weightiness of being human.
Yeah, the burden of our physical existence.
And that even though we might strive for lightness and transcendence, we're always going to be tethered to this kind of messy reality.
Right.
So then there's this other really important concept that we need to unpack, kitsch.
Kitsch.
Kundera defines it as a categorical agreement with being and the dictatorship of the heart. What does that actually mean?
So at its core, kitsch represents this kind of sentimental, idealized view of the world.
Yeah.
An embrace of cliches and these universally appealing images that evoke very strong shared emotions.
Okay, so it's about avoiding anything unpleasant or complex or contradictory
Exactly.
and just focusing on the things that make us feel good and unified.
Right, and morally upright.
Right.
There's this sense of self-congratulatory sentimentality to it.
Yeah, there's that great line about how kitsch causes two tears to flow in quick succession.
Right.
The first one says how beautiful, and the second one says how good mankind is.
Yeah, you're getting choked up just thinking about how good we all are. And Sabina has this very strong reaction against Kish. She sees it as her enemy, even more than communism.
Right.
And all her attempts to kind of inject these mystifications into her biography to conceal her Czech identity, it's all part of her struggle to escape this simplistic, sentimental narrative that she feels other people want to impose on her life.
Right, so she's trying to resist being pigeonholed.
Exactly. She wants to maintain her individuality in the face of this kind of overwhelming pressure to conform.
But Kundera suggests that no one can truly escape Kish.
Right.
That it's this inherent part of the human condition, this desire for these sentimental agreements and the avoidance of unpleasant truths.
Yeah.
He even talks about the kitsch of the Grand March, illustrating how political ideologies can become wrapped up in these emotionally charged images and slogans.
Right. And those images and slogans often obscure the complexities of reality.
They do. And it makes you think about the ways in which we all participate in kitsch to some extent.
Yeah. What are the sentimental narratives that we embrace without question? And do we ever stop to think about the emotions that they're designed to evoke in us?
It's a good challenge.
It is.
So finally, the excerpts that you sent touch on the later lives of Tomas and Tereza and their decision to move to the countryside.
Right.
They're searching for a simpler, maybe more authentic existence.
Yeah. And this move represents a real shift for them. It's a desire to step away from the complexities and pressures of their lives in Prague.
Yeah, and Tereza in particular seems to have this kind of romanticized vision of country life, maybe shaped by literature and her own longing for peace.
Yeah, but the reality, as always, is a bit more complicated. You see this through her relationship with Karenin, their dog.
Yeah.
Her bond with him is incredibly deep, and her grief when he falls ill is profound.
It's heartbreaking.
It is, and it isolates her in a way from the people around her.
It does.
Yeah.
And there's that scene with the neighbor who's almost dismissive of her sorrow over the dog. It's like they just don't speak the same language when it comes to grief. But within their own little world, Tomas and Tereza find this really deep connection.
Yeah.
And there's that beautiful image of Tereza's dream where Karenin gives birth to two rolls and a bee.
Right.
This kind of strange, surreal moment of consolation.
Yeah, a little bit of lightness in the midst of all this heaviness.
And we also see this hint of reconciliation between Tomas and his son Simon.
Yeah.
Tereza invites him to visit, and it suggests this potential for healing and connection.
Yeah, glimmer of hope.
But even in their final moments with Karenin as he's dying, there's a sense of solitude.
Mm-hmm.
They're together experiencing this profound loss, but ultimately each alone in their own sorrow.
Right.
So it's this really powerful image of even the closest relationships having these limits.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the unbearable lightness of being, we've really just scratched the surface of these really big ideas that Kundera explores.
Yeah, there's so much more to unpack.
The tension between lightness and weight,
Hmm.
the fleeting nature of our existence, the messiness of human relationships, and the ways in which history shapes our lives, both personal and political.
And the ways in which we grapple with these big questions.
Yeah, what does it mean to live a meaningful life when everything feels so temporary and uncertain?
Right.
So we encourage you, our listener, to keep thinking about these questions and maybe even revisit the book.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a reread.
It is, and to think about how these concepts of compassion and kitsch and lightness and weight play out in your own life,
Absolutely.
because ultimately these are questions that we all grapple with in our own way.
We do.
And maybe that's the unbearable lightness of it all,
Yeah.
that we're all in this together trying to make sense of it all.
Right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Sounds good.